So, alright, yesterday, um, I was discussing, in as much detail as I could possibly discuss, uh, the Doors and how they intricately tie in with the history of the USA. I discussed, as intricately as I could possibly discuss, um, what the hell was it? Oh yes, how all the bands from the state, how really we think of ourselves as we tend to think of rock and roll as this very American creation these days, and oftentimes in films or just in general, you'll hear that people put forth this idea that Americans created rock and roll, when in fact the English had so much to do with it, and I was trying to say almost embarrassingly so. But the English, the hand they played in the formation of rock and roll was really actually quite enormous. The hand they had, they took a huge chunk of the pie like very early on, and and now, even to this day, I think that London is seen almost as, I mean, it certainly is for me, seen as a place where the true spirit of rock and roll is sitting there in a huge way. Would someone might say, well, would you say New York had the spirit of rock and roll? And actually, I would say, cities actually are another big thing for any rock and roller, even just a fan, because cities have played a huge part in rock and roll, and so has the country. There's that famous video I was discussing. I discussed the Doors in depth because the Doors really were like, you can't gloss over them. They're like Columbus discovering the states. They were really the first, and I said this in the other video, and I'll repeat myself. They were really the first American group, I feel, to really, really compete with the Brits when it came to rock and roll. Because again, at that time, we had the Who, we had the Kinks, we had Zeppelin, we had the Stones, we had all these groups coming out of the UK, and of course, now it's remembered as the British invasion. And but what one question that's never asked is, why were the Brits able to do all of this and we weren't? And that is the question that I've consistently asked, not only myself, but also I've even, I've applied to others with the question, and most people don't seem to really think about it. And oftentimes it has been met with some surprise when I've said to people, hey, the great rock bands, really the early ones, the ones who created it, really in a big way, like, because if you think about it, I said this to somebody else the other day too. Again, we go back to the fact now that Pink Floyd and Zeppelin and the Doors, they've all become trendy. The Who not so much for some weird reason, but those other three, and even the Stones is definitely at this point they're trendy, like young city slicking hipsters, I suppose. They like to cite those bands, to seem cool, I guess. Now that's a good thing. That means it's surviving. That whenever the cool people are still, the quote unquote cool people are still carrying something with them, that means it's going to survive. Especially in this modern day culture where it's very important that like years. I mean, a lot of people forget this too. But if you want to now we're going to go way back to long before the USA and all that and all of this pop culture. I mean, the artists used to be funded by a patron, used to, and it wasn't the people, it was somebody in specific, and the Catholic Church, as much as they're such an enemy these days for the secular society, but they actually funded a great deal of art, and a lot of at least when it comes to painting or sculpture, they are the role that they played, the Catholic Church, is undeniable. Now it is true that some elements of greed and conquest, sadly do play into the creation we see, when we look back, do play into the creation of great art. I mean, Florence, the city, I have a flag there of Florence, Italy, a beautiful city upon this earth. You see that there. I mean, obviously, you don't create those huge churches, or you don't create things such as this, not having any resources, right? So, but And I do believe that the piano and everything was invented in Italy, and all these instruments, and that's a huge thing that I like to look into. But again, I got hold on a second. I was talking about how when you want to create great art, you need resources, and this brings us to England, curiously enough, because we, again, as I said, we state again and again, it seems, oh, rock and roll is a distinctly American creation, this and that. And, in a large way, it is. The idea of what's so well. All right. First, I'll try to discuss what I think is so um, why rock and roll truly is so American, and one of the biggest reasons is that rock and roll was the first time we see the microphone handed to a regular. Now, people who dislike hip hop very strongly, vehemently. I mean, there are a lot of criticisms one can hurl at hip hop, but hip hop is another thing that I will discuss in great depth at some other point, because rock and roll and hip hop are connected in many ways, but they're not connected in another way, and I kind of want to try to cover the connection that they have right now. And the connection really is just that rock and roll really is the first time we ever see the microphone, the real microphone, the big microphone. Like, again, keep in mind, regular people were, camera cut off, but regular people were always making music and doing their own thing. The problem was it was never being publicized. And I mean, at some point, certainly regular people were denied even the ability to carry the skills, and we do see this happens again in history, again and again. It's like a friggin' pattern. So to anyone listening in the future, maybe well, I'm not going to get into all that. I'm not going to get into apocalypse theories, but the fact is, at current points, certainly regular people have been completely denied the ability to hone skills and what have you. But with rock and roll, okay, so the thing is so important, and that's so American, and that shows because the spirit of America is kind of that industrious spirit, the do-it-yourself spirit, self-reliance, self-sustenance. I'll protect myself. I mean, we have this. This is where we see the pistol culture and everything, the gun culture. I mean, but the reason that's what many foreigners might not understand about the American gun culture is it is a vital part of the American country in some way. I mean, I'm not going to say that I support it, but I'll say that I understand it at the very least, because the American spirit is all about self-reliance. It's all about, we don't need someone else to come protect us. We got our own back here. It's independence, and rock and roll is a beautiful creation of this independence, because rock and roll again is like without that idea of self-reliance, self-sustenance, and all this, we could have never seen rock and roll be born, because rock and roll was all about that. It's all about self-reliance. It's all about independence. It's all about doing it your own way. This, that, and the other thing. And so, yes, in that sense, it's a very uniquely American creation. However, what did the English, in my opinion, add? Oh, and another English band that was forgotten, I do think they were certainly Queen. Queen was without a doubt English. Yeah, formed in London, 1970s. Now, they come in the 70s. But again, what do we see that the English have that maybe we didn't? To create this, to really put the oomph in rock and roll. Because again, remember, the blues artists, you can say it was about race, you can say it was about what you want, but the fact was, those blues artists, those Muddy Waters, those Robert Johnsons, they are great artists. There is no doubt about this. They shall be remembered for centuries. And then, also, this brings us to Hendrix. Now, Hendrix is the most bizarre. Again, we do see very bad racism. Again, no, I know, my sincere apologies. It's bad. But, alright, so with Hendrix, we see the worst racism. I think, yes, it's racism in general. I think his story, because his story, London plays the most important, and this is where it's like, it really connects, that you see it in his story, because Hendrix is a literal nobody until he goes and leaves the United States to go to London. Nobody even cared about Hendrix stateside. I mean, he was just a little like background guitar guy. He was playing in like cover bands in bars and everything. I mean, there's no shame in that. But then we see that he hops over the lake. he goes to England, and how the hell he got there is beyond me. But he goes there and he becomes a sensation. They really appreciate him. They didn't have, and a lot of people do say it was because, they didn't have that awful history that we have. And that was the other reason why, with Rays, regarding Rays. And they also had the ability to appreciate the blues, again, because they didn't have that awful history that we had. And, but it's so interesting how out of suffering, out of all this sorrow, out of all this madness, this desperate need for self-reliance, for self-independence, this desperate need for separation from England, all these things play a role in the creation of rock and roll. I mean, you just don't have it without that. So, just remember that. I mean, it is all connected, guys. Everything is connected in life. So and this is what I think is the problem with schooling a lot of the time. Now, I would never want to be an educator today because you can't teach people anything authentic. For instance, rock and roll is just not even included in the curriculum, which is absolutely pathetic. It's so pathetic. It's just shameful that you would not include rock and roll, that you would not include music in a great way in the curriculum of the average school kid. I can't believe it. This is it's baffling to me. It's pathetic. It's absurd. But I don't want to rant. I don't want to get angry. But I do get a little offended sometimes because I think it was the greatest thing ever, and I don't understand. I think it tells us so much about ourselves, and I just don't understand how the hell, it could not be taught to young people. But I don't know. I'm a fool. So, but. Yeah, so we see this it's this great thing, and I wanted to say, well, what did the English bring? What did the English bring to rock? That why were they able to get it off the ground? We built the plane, so to say, but they were the only ones who were able to fly it initially. And I'm absolutely certain that even the Doors wouldn't have been able to probably gain a following for their act had it not been for the popularity of the English bands. That were already hopping about at the time. And so what was it about the English that was able to get rock and roll off the ground? Well, a part of me wonders if it's because they simply had more resources. I mean, if you look at, I suppose, 60s England, I think that they, obviously it's a very wealthy country. And as much as we would hate to admit it, wealth does, again, as I said before, any creation of great art, you look somewhere and there's someone who's absurdly wealthy behind it, typically. And this is no different in rock and roll, because I do think that the English were absurdly wealthy. I mean, when you look at Zeppelin, when you really look at them, they were almost obnoxiously pretty little rich boys in a way. I mean, Jimmy Page was a very, to me, he has the air of nobility. He really does, and it's not nobility because he's a rock star. It's nobility because of the way he acted, the sort of culture he seems to have grown up around. He really does seem to have the air of nobility to me, which might be strange to say. I mean, maybe if Jimmy Page heard me say that, he would say, "I don't understand." But to me, he really does. He was playing. He just had this knowledge of folk songs, because again, the folk songs are largely coming out of Scotland, Ireland, all those places, and he just has this knowledge, and you see it the way he plays those acoustic licks, the way he plays. They've tried to put in orchestrated sounds, so there's just this air of nobility to really all the English bands, besides the Stones. Now, they were the one band who broke off from that big time and really picked up a lot of U.S. culture in their songs, and that's something else that we'll get into. There's so many things I have to talk about. The journey has been so long; it's been so incredible. There's so many things I have to talk about. And remember, we could not have had the rock and roll born if it hadn't have been for that incredible spirit of self-reliance, self-independence, do it your own way. Eat crap, England, but at the same time, we went and then we cooperated with them. So. Because, I mean, the early Americans did say, I'm not saying it now, I don't want to offend any English people, but, I mean, the early Americans were, obviously, rigidly against, the British Empire, so, I mean, there was a war fought over it, I mean, it was a long time ago, but there was a war fought over it, and it does, believe it or not, it seems absurd, but that word does actually kind of wind up playing a role in the creation of the great rock music. And, yeah, that's about all I have to say in this video. Ciao.